Okay, today we're going to discuss the cellular respiration and fermentation. So, as we know that cellular respiration is basically the reverse of photosynthesis. So, we're also later on going to discuss the photosynthesis. So, cellular respiration is all about the metabolic pathways that include the glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and yeah, and also electron transport chain. So it is mainly focused on the production of energy in the form of ATP. So first thing first I need to know and understand about cellular respiration is its equation and what the equation means. So the equation is here on your right. That's the equation of cellular respiration. So it tells you that okay, we have C6H12O6. So this is your what? Your glucose. So glucose added to oxygen. So glucose and oxygen in cellular respiration they give products carbon dioxide and water. These two products, the carbon dioxide and water, you're gonna see where they get produced, especially the water. You'll see that water gets produced in the what? As we undergo the electron transport chain. So you'll see where each product gets formed. Also have the formation of energy in the form of ATP, and this energy gets formed through what? Through what we call chemiosmosis. So your glucose gets oxidized to what? To carbon dioxide, and that oxygen of yours it becomes reduced to what? To H2O. So that is the equation of what? Of of cellular respiration. So basically, you can see that glucose gets broken down into what? Into carbon dioxide. So glucose is a what? Is a large molecule. So since it becomes oxidized into carbon dioxide, we can tell or we can say that cellular respiration is an example of a catabolic pathway. Now, let's differentiate our question number one on chapter 9. It says differentiate between catabolic pathway and anabolic pathway and also give an example for each. So what we know about a catabolic pathway is that it is that pathway that involves the breakdown of large molecules into simpler molecules, and in the process it produces energy or it releases energy in the process. And then an anabolic pathway is a pathway that involves the build up of large molecules from simpler molecules, and it uses energy in the form of ATP to build those large molecules from simpler molecule. An example of a catabolic pathway, like I said, you can talk about what cellular respiration. And to be specific, you can to say glycolysis. So we also have an anabolic pathway example, which can be photosynthesis. Photosynthesis another is an example of anabolic pathway, and another example of anabolic pathway is what we call gluconeogenesis. Those are the examples. So moving on to question 2, which says mention three stages of cellular respiration and the location in which they occur. Like I said, cellular respiration include glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and also the last one being oxidative phosphorylation. So these are the three stages of cellular respiration, which include glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. So glycolysis basically is the breakdown of glucose into pyruvate, and it breaks them down into two molecules of pyruvate. And citric acid cycle is it basically completes the breakdown of that glucose which was broken down into glycolysis, and it ends up producing the carbon dioxide. So um, oxidative phosphorylation, it accounts for for the most ATP synthesis. So in this oxidative phosphorylation, this is where you have electrons coming from the two electron carriers. The two electron carriers are NADH and FADH2. These are two electron carriers that transfer electrons or carries electrons to the oxidative phosphorylations, where they are used or further used to to synthesize ATP. So um, yes, these are the three stages, and why do they occur? Glycolysis occur in the cytosol, whereas the citric acid cycle occurs in the mitochondria, together with with the oxidative phosphorylation, also occur in in the mitochondria. So now let's move to question number 3, which says mention two main electron carriers in cellular respiration. We just spoke about them. The two main electron carriers in cellular respiration is is NADH and FADH2. These are the two main electron carriers in cellular respiration. So moving on, question number 4 says, what are the two major phases of glycolysis and what happens in each phase? The two major phases of glycolysis is that it includes the anaerobic phase and the aerobic phase. So glycolysis can uh, either be aerobic or anaerobic. So what happens in each is that one of the glycolysis which occurs in, let's say, the anaerobic glycolysis, it occurs in the absence of oxygen, and the aerobic glycolysis occurs in the presence of oxygen, and it results in the formation of uh, carbon dioxide and water through citric acid cycle, where it also uses acetyl CoA to enter the citric acid cycle. And then the anaerobic one, it forms lactate, and it also forms alcohol. So those are the two main phases of glycolysis. So this is basically, let me show this part. So this is basically what happens in in the cellular respiration. So you must be able to have this picture in your mind. So what happens here is that in cytosol, what happens is that glycolysis occurs, And then in the mitochondrion, citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation they occur there. And then glycolysis, we said it is the breakdown of glucose to pyruvate. And then what does it do? It forms ATP, where at substrate level of phosphorylation, or it releases ATP at substrate level of what? Of phosphorylation. So electrons that gets absorbed through the breakdown of this glucose, they get carried away by what? NADH, and also by FADH2 in the what? Okay, in the glycolysis is all only about NADH, and then in citric acid cycle is about they are carried by NADH and FADH2. So what happens after pyruvate gets formed is that this pyruvate will react with what we call coenzyme A. So the coenzyme A, when pyruvate reacts with coenzyme A, it forms what we call acetyl-CoA through pyruvate oxidation. This acetyl-CoA, it gets used is a form of pyruvate, or is a form that is allowed to do what? To enter the citric acid cycle, because pyruvate cannot enter citric acid cycle as its own or by itself. It needs the help of what? Acetyl-CoA. So those electrons carried by NADH and FADH2, they go to oxidative phosphorylation, where electron transport chain and chemiosmosis occur for what? For ATP production. So you must also understand that understand is that for each molecule of glucose degraded to carbon dioxide, remember carbon dioxide gets formed where? In the citric acid cycle. So for each molecule of glucose degraded to this carbon dioxide and water by respiration, the cell makes up to 32 molecules of what? Of ATP. So this is the amount of ATP that gets formed in the cellular respiration. So we spoke about the two major phases of glycolysis, and we also tried to explain what happens in each. So what is the intermediary product of glycolysis? The intermediary product of glycolysis is pyruvate. Pyruvate is the what? Is the intermediary product of glycolysis. It's the major intermediary product of glycolysis. So number 6, it says the citric acid cycle, which we haven't spoken about as of yet. But the citric acid cycle does what? Completes the breakdown of pyruvate to oxygen and generate the 2 ATP and 2 FADH2 only per turn. So here they need you to tell us if whether is this true or is it false. So obviously this is false. Why? Because the cycle, which is the citric acid cycle, what it does is that it oxidizes the glucose derived from what? From pyruvate, and it generates what? So the pyruvates get broken down to what? To carbon dioxide, not oxygen, and it also generates 1 ATP, not 32, and 3 NADH, not 3 NADH and 1 FADH2, not 2 FADH2, only per 10. So this is the correct answer to the citric acid cycle. It generates carbon dioxide and generates 1 ATP, 3 NADH, and 1 FADH2 per 10. Keep note of that. So Moving on to number 7, it says differentiate between chemiosmosis and electron transport chain. The difference here is that one transports electrons to the what to the ATP generating machine or machinery, and then chemiosmosis involves the what the the creation of what of of uh, of that ATP or the production of ATP. So what you need to understand is this, that okay, remember we spoke about NADH and FADH2. So they do what, they donate electrons to the electron transport chain, which powers ATP synthesis via oxidative phosphorylation. So what actually happens in electron transport chain is that okay, in the electron transport chain, uh, electrons get to be dropped in free energy as they go down the chain and are finally passed to oxygen, forming what? Forming H2O, right? So during the pathway, so this is an important part that you can use for differentiating. So during the the pathway, electrons, remember we said that they are transported, or they are, we get them from any H and evade H. So those electrons, they get transported to the what, to the electron transport chain by the what, by the help of proteins, which are also said to be the cytochromes. So the electron transport chain, it generates no ATP directly. What generates ATP directly is the chemiosmosis. So what the electron transport chain does is that it breaks the large free energy drop from food to oxygen, like we said up there, like we said on this point, that what it does is that it facilitates the electron drop in free energy as they go down the chain and are finally passed to oxygen. So uh, its main purpose is to produce what, this oxygen, so that there is a formation of what, of H2O. Remember the equation of cellular respiration. It says and here there must be a production of what, there must be production of carbon dioxide plus H2O plus NH in the form of ATP, right? So this is where the ATP, this is where H2O gets formed. H2O gets formed where, in the electron transport chain. Where does carbon dioxide get formed? In the citric acid cycle, which is also called TCA or Krebs cycle. So now let's see where ATP gets to be formed. This ATP, ATC gets forms H2O. This one gets formed in chemiosmosis. Now let's go and check what chemiosmosis is. So chemiosmosis, it involves an enzyme which is said to be an ATP synthase. So this ATP synthase, it uses what we call an hexagonic flow of H plus ions to drive phosphorylation of ATP. So by so doing, it generates what, the ATP. So basically, chemiosmosis is for ATP synthesis and electron transport chain is for production of H2O. That's the difference. So now differentiate between two types of fermentation. The two types of fermentation that we have is alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Now before we get to that, let's check this out. So if you look at this, you'll see what is oxidative phosphorylation. So you have a part of electron transport chain which ends here, and you also have a part of chemiosmosis. So if you look at chemiosmosis, we said that chemiosmosis involves a what we call an ATP synthase, which is an enzyme. So, this chemiosmosis, it involves electron transfer in the what in the electron transport chain. So remember, the electron transfer from the electron transport chain, it causes the proteins, that are on the plasma membrane to do what? To pump H plus from the mitochondrial matrix to the what? To the intermembrane space. The intermembrane space is this part, the orange part. So it causes that to happen. So when these H plus are outside, they're gonna be able to do what? To move back into the what? To move back into the uh, mitochondria through the what? Through the help of ATP synthase. So this is where they get back into the what? Into ATP synthase. So as they do that, ADP, which is this ATP, gets to be regenerated to what? To ATP. So that is how ATP gets to be generated there. Because this ATP synthase causes the phosphorylation of ATP, which forms ATPs. So that is just it. So that's how chemiosmosis and electron transport chain differs. In electron transport chain, if you see, you have NADH, you have FADH2, they transport their electrons through the help of the proteins, which are said to be the cytochromes. And at the end, there will be formation of what? Formation of this H2O of ours here. So that is all about the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. So we're still talking about number. Also, have to discuss number 8. So number 8 says discuss how ATP can be produced in the absence of oxygen. So basically, here we're talking about in when there is no oxygen, basically. So we want to explain how ATP can be formed in the absence of oxygen. So ATP can be formed in the absence of oxygen by being coupled with what we call by coupling glycolysis with what we call fermentation. So without this oxygen, still the electron transport chain will do what? Will not be able to operate. So if it doesn't operate, does it mean that we can't form ATP? No, we can still form ATP, but the amount of ATP that is gonna be formed in without oxygen is less compared to the one that is formed in the presence of oxygen. So glycolysis, when there is no oxygen, glycolysis couples with what? With fermentation or anaerobic respiration to produce ATP. So they want us to discuss how ATP can be produced in the absence of oxygen. So ATP can be produced in the absence of oxygen by coupling glycolysis with fermentation or with anaerobic respiration to produce ATP. So this means as you explain this, you can talk about the breakdown of what? Of glucose into what? Into pyruvate. And this pyruvate will enter what? Will enter lactic acid fermentation, or it's going to enter what? Alcohol fermentation. So through these two, it can be able to produce what? ATP, but only two ATPs are going to be formed in each pathway. So that is how you're going to explain it. So now, and you must also be aware of the marks there. So now, differentiate. Another question comes and say, number 9, differentiate between two types of fermentation. Like I said, we have alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Of course, you cannot be asked the number 8, question 8 and question 9 in the exam. It's either they're gonna ask you about question 8 or they're gonna ask you about question 9. They can't both be there because they require the same answer, almost the same answer. So those different types of fermentation involves the alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Alcohol fermentation involves the formation of specifically ethanol in the absence of oxygen, and lactic acid fermentation involves the formation of lactate. So now let's look further into it and see what they are all about. So like we said, in alcohol fermentation, pyruvate is converted to what? To ethanol, right? So an example of this alcohol fermentation, it can be using yeast in brewing or winemaking or baking or whatsoever. That can be an example. So in lactic acid fermentation, pyruvate gets to be reduced to what? NADH. And in the process it forms what you call what? Lactate as an end product with no release of carbon dioxide. But with alcohol fermentation, there is a release of what? Of carbon dioxide. In lactic acid fermentation, there is no release of carbon dioxide. So this is mostly facilitated by human muscles as well to generate ATP when oxygen is scarce. So that is the difference between those two. Now, number 10, what is the difference between obligate anaerobes and facultative anaerobes? This question you're gonna see it somewhere. You see, the questions that are involved in here are gonna help you to understand any question that might come under cellular respiration. So the obligate anaerobes, they are those anaerobes that do what? That that carry out fermentation or anaerobic respiration, and they cannot survive in the presence of oxygen. They cannot survive in the presence of oxygen, whereas the facultative anaerobes, they can survive using either fermentation or cellular respiration. So these ones, they don't care if there is oxygen or there is no oxygen. They can survive either way. So that is the difference between those those two. Keep it in mind. You're gonna see it somewhere. So we also have what we call beta oxidation, which basically is just a process that involves the breakdown of fatty acids into into ATP. So that's basically a beta oxidation. So it involves the breakdown of what? Of fatty acids into what? Into acetyl CoA, and it yields what? It yields ATP in the process. So that is what beta oxidation is all about. It's basically the breakdown of what? Of these fatty acids to acetyl CoA. So we also have question 12, which says explain how ATP is synthesized in oxidative phosphorylation. Here, basically, you have to explain what? You have to explain chemiosmosis. Question 12, you have to explain chemiosmosis because this is what we're talking about. Explain how ATP is synthesized where? In oxidative phosphorylation. ATP is synthesized where? In the chemiosmosis. So you basically have to explain chemiosmosis. So here, what happens is that you have what? You have transport chain. You have the proteins that pump what? That pump H plus ions from the mitochondrial matrix to the what? Intermembrane space. And then those H plus then move back to across the membrane, passing through the what? The proton. And that protein is what? ATP synthase is an enzyme as well. So this ATP synthase, it uses the hexagonic flow of H plus to drive the phosphorylation of ATP. So that is basically uh, the process whereby ATP gets to be formed, because once the ADP gets to be phosphorylated or reacting with the inorganic phosphate, they form what? The ATPs. So here you just need to explain or talk about the chemiosmosis. So now let's see question 13, which speaks about the regulation of cellular respiration. How cellular respiration is regulated via feedback mechanism. So this is basically what you need to talk about. You just need to tell us about this. That okay, if ATP concentration begins to drop, respiration speeds up, and when there is plenty of ATP, respiration slows down. That's it. So that's it for cellular respiration. Now let's look into photosynthesis.